With Deck of Lunacy absolutely running rampant on the ladder right now, I decided to ask my Twitter what they thought were the most degenerate decks in Hearthstone's history. So today we're going to be making a tier list to figure out what is exactly the most degenerate deck that's ever graced Hearthstone's path. So here are the tier lists that we're going to be using for this video. I'm going to be basing this off of my own opinion on the decks, whether or not I enjoyed them, but I'm also going to be trying factoring whether or not the community was outraged by a particular aspect or a certain card in these decks that we'll be discussing. So feel free to agree or to disagree with my opinions, and feel free to give me all the hate and love in the comments that you can possibly give me, because I'm willing to discuss some of my opinions on some of these picks, because I've already listed them out, and I'm going to be going through them one by one in order to really give you my assessment on them. But let's go ahead and just jump right into the most degenerate decks that have ever graced Hearthstone's history. The first deck that we'll be looking at is actually a deck that I managed to hit rank 3 legend with before, and it is the Flamewaker Giants Quest Mage deck. This was, I believe, before Quest Mage was actually nerfed to you have to play 8 random spells, or I'm sorry, 8 spells that weren't generated in your deck. But this deck was just absolutely dominant for the longest time in the wild meta. Like, the whole point of the deck was just to play the quest with Vargoth, and you just instantly won. If your opponent had an ice block, it was just not good enough in order to stop this combo. So people just started going for like the all-out aggression with being able to kill people with Flamewaker. And then in addition to that, you also had Sorcerer's Apprentice and 1-mana cards, so if you couldn't kill people with Giants, then you had huge Flamewaker turns. And as time went on, this deck kind of went towards like a more Giants build, but I'm choosing to focus on this one because both decks are very, very similar in how they play and how they actually aim to kill you. But I'm going to go ahead and put this in the A tier in order to give you guys a good understanding of what I'm believing is degenerate, because this was an absolutely degenerate deck to say the least, but there are a lot of other decks that are just insanely more ridiculous than even Quest Mage was. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, the next deck is Naga Warlock. This was a deck that was just aimed to kill you as early as turn 4 if you had your Naga Sea Witch available in hand. Back in the day, this card were to literally make every single one of your cards cost 5 mana, and the way that it worked with the Giants is that since Giants reduce their mana cost, if you literally had, okay, so you had a Mountain Giant in your hand. If you had the Naga played, then suddenly your Mountain Giant becomes a 5-drop, and you have 4 cards in hand, then your Mountain Giant becomes 1 mana. So there's a lot of situations to where you were just able to spam almost all the Giants that you had and just win the game as early as turn 4 because you were able to summon like over 30 damage in stats in 1 turn. And this was just absolutely ridiculous, and this was actually when Wild was very first introduced as an actual format. And this was like back when like Naga was not even seeing any play whatsoever. So it was a complete jump out of left field, but it was a deck that was just so powerful that even a Hunter deck was able to play this for a little bit. Like I played the Hunter deck a little bit before I played the Warlock deck because I thought it was better to get more copies of the Giant or get the Naga as early as possible with like Stitch Tracker and stuff like that. But the Warlock deck just had more consistent draw and as well as removal and healing, so it just became the go-to for this archetype. But this archetype definitely goes in the S tier because of how ridiculous it just broke a format and how it had to make Naga Sea Witch go from 5 mana to 8 mana, which is a nerf that we don't really get to see cards go to that big of a jump. Next up, we have Miracle Rogue back in the days when Gadgetzan was 5 mana. So this was a very degenerate deck because if you didn't have anything that was able to pressure Rogue quick enough, or if you didn't have a way to deal with the Stealth Auctioneer, then you just couldn't deal with the amount of spells and the amount of burst that Rogue had at the time. And this was a meta-defining deck, but I'm going to go ahead and put this in the B tier because as Hearthstone's history gets even more insane, doing wacky things with Gadgetzan I don't believe warrants like a high enough rating. Like at the time, this was definitely one of the most degenerate decks out there, but I believe that like the thing about Miracle Rogue is just that you needed to be able to get your Gadgetzan, and there were ways to be able to stop it. It's not like you were dying from like turn 1, turn 2 or something like that when you were going up against this deck. And if you were playing Warrior, sometimes you can like outdo all the damage that they had. So even though this deck was very degenerate in the ways of you just lost if your opponent had the sweet gadget turn, sweet gadget turns in this tier list, in my opinion, are not good enough to make the top cut. And to give you an example of a deck that I absolutely believe makes the top cut, that gets an SS rank before I even tell you what the deck is Deathrattle Hunter with Undertakers. Oh my god, this deck was absolutely ridiculous and was actually the reason why I hate Hunter to this very day. It was the very first expansion that I ever got to play in was when Naxxramas came out, and Undertaker Hunter was the Oh my god, it was literally the nuts deck to play. Like, if you played Undertaker into a Deathrattle minion, into another Undertaker into a Deathrattle minion, you just won the game. Like, there are even situations where you can play both of your Undertakers and then just play 2 Deathrattle minions immediately if you had the coin. And if you were playing a Priest, like, GG, dude. Like, you have no way of beating them, even if you played a Shudderwock Pain to get rid of one of the Undertakers, and suddenly your opponent plays another Deathrattle minion into hero power, and then they have a 4/5 and 2 Deathrattle minions that are already hitting you in the face, in addition to one that they just played. So just, oh my god, this deck literally tilts me to this day even thinking about, because I was a Control Warrior player and just, I was bad at the game, so me losing that matchup was still kind of bad, but that deck had like a 70% win rate over the entire field. So I think that I really believe this is justified as an SS, because it made me want to stop playing Hearthstone at the very beginning. So luckily I still persevered and still kept playing, but geez, man, this deck was just ridiculous. Next up is a deck to where everyone's going to want to get in here, because it is Patron Warrior. And some people are actually going to, think that this is a very controversial take, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that I believe that Patron Warrior deserves a solid C tier on the degenerate list. Now, before you start getting angry in the comments, let me go ahead and explain myself, because I understand that Patron Warrior was a ridiculous deck that just killed you very, very quickly if you had the absolute god tier nuts of Garrison Commander, Death Spite, and your patrons just being able to literally never die. But the reason why I'm putting it at a C tier is because this deck had a very, very high skill cap, to where I believe it's still one of the hardest Hearthstone decks that has ever been in the game's history. So it's like, when you won with this deck, I believe you actually deserved it, unless it was just like, something that was anybody could kind of win with. And that's like kind of like the theme that I want to kind of point out with this tier list, in my opinion, and why I'm deciding the tiers that I am, is because just because it's degenerate doesn't mean that it's hard to pull off. Like, if it's a hard combo in order to set up and then you do it well, the combo itself may be degenerate, but the deck itself is still fine. And that's kind of like what I'm trying to get at with the tier listing, with Patron Warrior being a C tier. So, like, the deck was ridiculous, yes, but if you had the right skill in order to pilot this deck, it was one of those decks where it's like, okay, that was actually pretty cool. And so next up, a deck that I believe that was kind of cool, but it was way more degenerate and just way too easy to pop off, was the 4-mana Apothecary Rogue, to where you just were able to play Coin Apothecary while you had a weapon equipped, and you immediately you immediately drew an Anubisath, I think, Defender, or Anubisath Anubisath Warbringer. That was the card. So it's a 9-mana 9/7. Gives Deathrattle to +3/+3 to all of your minions in hand. So suddenly you just played this weapon that triggered that Deathrattle on the 4-drop, and you had an entire hand that pretty much became a quest rogue like strategy, to where you just storm the field with little minions that often had charge, and you just won immediately. So this is the reason why Apothecary got nerfed from 4-mana to 5-mana, and since then the card has not been as problematic. You can still kind of do this deck, but it's just not as as fast as it's supposed to be, because good lord, like like this deck was just, it was kind of a debate whether or not it was top tier. It was definitely annoying, to say the least, and when it popped off, it definitely couldn't lose. And that's comparable to like 4-mana Barnes, and in standard they definitely didn't want that to happen. So that's the reason I'm gonna go ahead and put this at a solid A tier, because like this deck had weaknesses, and I feel like it got nerfed not just because the combo was ridiculous, but just because there was way too many negative emotions associated with the 4-mana Apothecary, and it just went way too smoothly with the 3-mana weapon. So I believe that this is a solid A tier, because there's a lot of other degenerate decks that are out there, and this actually got curbed pretty quickly. Up next, we might have some people that are scared of some certain 4-mana 7/7s that have, very bad memories of when Aggro Shaman from Old Gods was just absolutely dominant on the meta. Like, some people are not going to agree with my tiering on this, because, again, my definition of degenerate is a little bit different than most people, but I am putting this at a solid A tier just because of the sheer amount of like power it had on the meta, and how it changed essentially everybody, to where if you're not playing Shaman, you had to play something that beat Shaman. So I think that I think there was a Control Priest that could actually somewhat deal with Shaman, but it wasn't as consistent as slamming a 4-mana 7/7 and just hoping your opponent doesn't have you know, a BGH or a Death at the time. And I believe BGH was actually nerfed to 5 mana, so like a lot of people weren't really running him in order to stop this. But regardless, like Aggro Shaman was just absolutely ridiculous in terms of how consistent it was able to kill people on like turn 5, turn 6. And so I believe, you know, at an A tier, it's pretty solid, because, but it doesn't like reach like Naga Warlock yet in terms of like game-breaking bustedness, to where I believe that's what's going to classify most of these S tier decks. But A tier for Aggro Shaman seems pretty fair in my eyes. Next up is a deck that has a lot of frustration, and I'm choosing to highlight a deck that wasn't necessarily as popular as its counterpart Highlander Mage at the time, but it's actually Conjurer's Mage with Box in it. And this is like a kind of like a mix between like what Highlander Mage was able to do and what Conjurer's Mage was doing before Conjurers got nerfed to 4 mana. Because there was a time where it was literally just Conjure Mage and Control Warrior with Boom in it that was just completely ruling the meta. So you either had one of two options: generate a ridiculous board to where your opponent can't deal with it, or somehow control it. But this is a deck that went in a different direction and went a lot more for the randomness, because Dragoncaster was still 6 mana. And if you're able to play Coin into Dragoncaster for value and then play Box, then there were some times where like you were just able to generate boards that your opponent had no business in being able to even think about destroying. So for this reason, I am putting it at an S tier, because a deck that literally thrives on 2 puzzle boxes being able to be played as soon as possible, as well as being able to cheat out ridiculous value out of the Conjurer's Calling, I think that this is a really solid S tier, because there was a time where Conjurer's Mage was on top, and this deck was just definitely not something that people enjoyed to see on top of that meta. The next deck is definitely a deck that I believe 80% of the Hearthstone community absolutely hates if they've ever played Wild, and if they definitely hate Priest, they're not gonna like this deck. But it is Big Priest with Barnes and Yasharaj in it. Like, this is a deck that was just absolutely ridiculous, and throughout the time, like throughout the ages, this deck just got even more beef and even more minions, to where it, like, Barnes just isn't even used anymore. So I'm just gonna go ahead and combine Big Priest and Rez Priest as one deck, just because they're very similar in how they play. You just aim to get like the big minion as soon as possible, and hope that you just keep bringing them back with cards that are very cheap to bring back 10 mana cards. You're cheating all of this mana all the time. And I originally had this at a B tier. Because Big Priest with just Barnes and Yasharaj, it was game-breaking and it was annoying to go up against, but it wasn't actually meta-defining. But with all the cards that Rez Priest has gotten throughout the years, I am changing that to an S tier, because we're combining it with Rez Priest. So with like Blood of Cahoon, for example, like that card just absolutely drilled the nail in the coffin for how Big Priest is just never going to be a deck that is going to be that fun to go up against unless you are the one playing it. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and put this from B tier to the S tier, because this isn't a fun deck. The more I think about it and the more I try to justify giving it like a lower rank, it is just not fun, and it is a legitimate reason why people quit the game. So I'm going to go ahead and, you know, barge on this one a little bit, because even though I didn't think the deck was that degenerate, I cannot ignore the community outcry for how much they wanted Barnes to see a nerf from 4 mana to 5, and then just how Rez Priest just keeps seeing something every expansion. It's like, oh god, let this deck die. Next up is the deck that is actually tormenting Hearthstone at the moment, and it is Lunacy Mage. This deck is just absolutely the definition of just go for Lunacy, play it as soon as possible, and hope that you high roll the game in some way or another, and just let RNG take the wheel. Like, there's really no other way to explain this deck, because, I mean, okay, aside from the times that you don't play Lunacy, it's essentially a burn mage that's, you know, trying to deal all the damage to face as quickly as possible, because you do have AoE, but you really don't have any other ways of killing your opponents, unless you happen to get some really good minions off of the random spells that you find, or like your Fauna powers, for example. But aside from that, the reason I'm going to put this at an A tier, that's right, I'm putting Lunacy Mage at an A tier, is because not only is, I don't feel like Deck of Lunacy itself is the problem, it's all the situations that are surrounding Deck of Lunacy in order to enable it to become a problem. Because as time goes on, Deck of Lunacy is going to become a more, like, it's going to become a worse card. It is really bad right now, but another reason why I'm deciding that it's also A tier is because Secret Paladin right now has an obscenely higher win rate than than Lunacy Mage. So it's just like, this deck can be beat, it has weaknesses, and it's not even the top deck at the moment. So it's like, for that reason, I really feel like it's solid at an A tier, because it doesn't quite reach like the ridiculousness of S tier in my opinion, just because it has ways of losing. It does have insane comebacks. Like, I'm not knocking the insane amount of mana cheat that this deck has, and trust me, I've played Skull with this deck for Outcast, so like, good freaking lord. This deck has some ridiculous ways of being able to turn the game around, but I believe it's a solid A tier, maybe A plus if I had like that kind of tier going for it, just because of all the other decks that have been in Hearthstone's history, even more ridiculous than Lunacy Mage just winning with like a turn 2 deck of Lunacy. There's ways to beat the deck. It's not the best deck around, and I believe that since the nerf is also happening very, very quickly and more spells are going to be added to the pool, it's not going to become as degenerate as time goes on. The next deck is Secret Mage. We hate Secret Mage. SS tier. But to give a short explanation on why I hate Secret Mage, it's just a deck that never feels good to play up against. And when you have literally Cabal Lackey into Rigged Fair Game, it's just not a deck that I am ever interested in playing up against, because Wild, I believe, has, I think, 16 Mage secrets. So as a new player who has no idea what those secrets are, all you are thinking about is, well, I might as well attack and see what happens. And I am not about, like, secrets are one of my least favorite thing in Hearthstone, and I'm fine with them existing in the game, but I wish it wasn't so frustrating to go up against some of these cards, because like, it's not even the fact that popping off secrets is annoying, it's the effects that some of these secrets have that are just completely mind-boggling. Like, you look at Ice Block compared to like literally anything Hunter has, and it's like, dude, why is this even in the game kind of deal? Like, I'm fine with Ice Block as a thing, but just to give an example of like how ridiculous some of these spells are. And then you look at like Rigged Fair Game, where it's like, dude, what? We can play this on turn 1 and get value? Like, Secret Mage, SS tier, because I hate it. It's the deck that literally made me almost quit the Wild format, and just, if this deck gets more support, I'm going to lose my mind. Next up is probably the reason why most people hate Druid, and it is the Knights of the Frozen Throne Jade Druid. This was a time where you just played Druid because it was literally, like, any Druid deck was S tier, because it had Wild Growth for 2 mana, it had Jade Blossom, and it had Ultimate Infestation. So this was just Druid was literally in its own tier as a class. And I believe, like, aside from, like, when Demon Hunter came out, we haven't really seen something, like, this severe in terms of, like, power level with like, one class just dominating over everything. And the interesting thing about Jade Druid is that, like, this is a deck that's always been somewhat relevant because of, you know, like, just being able to summon big green men is actually somewhat powerful when you have a 1 mana, like, 20/20 that's hitting the field. But the biggest power on this deck was not only just the ability of it drawing its deck and being able to summon out big minions, but you have massive amounts of armor gain with this deck. Like, oh my god, like, Ferocious Howl. I don't think it's in this deck particularly, but it's just one common example. And then you have cards like Branching Paths as well, which I believe came out in the Kobolds meta, so Jade Druid had a lot going for it, and this particular deck doesn't really like focus a lot on like armor. But as time went on for Jade Druid, it just has so many different ways of being able to be played. So it's just really, really interesting to see how this deck used to be like absolutely game breaking, and nowadays like half of these cards aren't even on the list. I mean, some of them are nerfed, so that's, you know, reasonable and that kind of stuff. But Jade Druid as an archetype is going in an SS tier because of its absolutely bonkers capability that it had back in the day. And like I said, it was the very first time that we saw like Druid just absolutely dunk on everything in the meta. Like, it was not up for discussion that Druid was not number 1. It was just the best. Next up is a deck that I actually enjoy immensely, but a lot of people don't seem to like, is actually Cubelock. And I'm not necessarily talking about what Cubelock has evolved into. I'm going to try and focus on the Kobolds and Catacombs, Knights of the Frozen Throne era of when Cubelock was really, really popular. So we're talking about like 5 mana, 6 mana Possessed Lackey. We're talking about Skull. We're talking about Doomguard. We're talking about the old school Cubelock to when Carnivorous Cube was a card that people were still trying to figure out, but they obviously knew that this card was busted in Warlock. So to those of you who don't know, this deck was just about making big minions and making a lot of them, because Cube is a really, really fair card that destroys a minion, and then when the cube dies, it summons 2 copies of it. So when you have cards like Dark Pact and stuff like that to kill them, you are able to do lots amount of burst, or lots of or insane amounts of building up defenses and stuff like that, because you had like cards like Void Lord that were just introduced. Like, Cobalt of Catacombs was a godsend to Warlock, because Ungoro was probably the most infuriating time to be a Warlock player because Zoo couldn't work. Like, if you're a Warlock and aggro decks don't, if you can't play control and then suddenly your Zoo capabilities are awful, then you're just not going to have a lot going for a Warlock player. So then suddenly they were just given everything that they could possibly ask for a control combo deck, and it just was tier 1, tier S actually, I would say, almost immediately on top of like, oh god, I forget what was really popular back in the Kobolds meta, but then when Knights of the Frozen Throne came out, then like, you know, Jade Druid and Reno Priest were really, really popular. But Cubelock is just a deck that I've actually really enjoyed immensely because of the cool lethal puzzles and like the intricate turns that you have to take in order to not only like, you know, it's not about building a big board now, it's about utilizing resources and making sure that your opponent is, you know, being able to be at bay some of the time to where you're just not absolutely like steamrolling the game. Like, there are a lot of times that I believe that Cubelock was just a really, really interesting deck that wasn't as simple as just mindlessly playing Doomguards to the face. So that's the reason why I'm going to put it at an A tier, because this is kind of like this is a fair deck, and that's why I'm pulling it back a little bit, because it is a little ridiculous with what cubes and what Doomguards can enable, and especially with like Skull if you couldn't have like any kind of weapon removal. But I believe it's an A tier because in the games to where you couldn't just, you know, immediately win the game and high roll them, you actually had to plan ahead and use your cubes in a very efficient manner. Next up is a deck that I took to insane heights in my competitive Hearthstone career, and it is Shudderwock Shaman. And I'm talking about the real Shudderwock Shaman. This is actually a deck that I played card for card in the oh god, in DreamHack Austin 2018. And fun fact, I was able to beat the undefeated Ike because I had an unbelievable Shudderwock turn, and I still have not been able, like, I've not been able to top this competitive Hearthstone feat at all. I haven't been able to win an Open Cup or anything like that. So this is going to be my coup de grace in the Hearthstone, in my Hearthstone competitive career. But regardless of my own sentiments of this is just an absolute bonkers deck because Shudderwock itself is a card that I'm pretty sure just made some people quit because they looked at it and they're like, I don't even want to look at this. Like, get this card away from me. But like, the biggest thing about this deck was the amount of versatility that it had, to where if you wanted to take it in a more aggro direction, you could have. You wanted to be rewarded for like a more mid-range control aspect because you need to be able to, you know, survive. That's the biggest thing about this deck, was just, you know, living to the Shudderwock turn. But as time goes on, Shudderwock itself was able to be put in so many different memes, so many memes that I played, that's for sure. And lots of different, like, in a lot of different decks that just, like, were able to utilize it in different ways, because battle cries are, you know, it's literally one of the most diverse mechanics in Hearthstone out there, so that means Shudderwock can do so many different things. But this application of Shudderwock Shaman, I believe, goes in the S tier, because not only was it meta-defining, it was infuriating on day one. Like, they had to immediately, patch how fast the animations go on Shudderwock, because, you know, you just waited there for like 10 minutes for this animation to go off, and you're like, well, might as well leave the game. And it's part of like the original Hostage Shaman, because of, you know, people just didn't want to deal with the animations. So I think for that reason, Shudderwock goes in the S tier, because not only was it like an actually good meta-defining deck, not only was it infuriating, but it was also a deck that literally just, you couldn't wait for the animations to end, and you're just like, please don't say that battle cry one more time, I'm gonna go crazy. Next up is Bomb Warrior. This is a deck that a lot of people don't like because they don't like cards in their deck helping their opponent when you draw them. And unfortunately for Bomb Warrior, all you really needed to do was technically shuffle 6 bombs in the deck, because then there's 30 damage available. But like, if you really think about it, every single weapon swing with the Wrench Caliber effectively dealt at least 8 damage, because you're dealing 3 damage with the weapon itself, and then 5 damage when the bomb actually gets drawn. But you want to know what? Bomb Warrior is a B tier in my opinion. And you want to know why? Because even when Bomb Warrior was like, I don't want to say meta-defining, it was definitely on top, but it wasn't like the deck that everyone was actively trying to play around at the time. And I'm choosing to highlight the time when Bomb Warrior had so many ways of actually getting the bomb out, to where it wasn't just a hardcore control warrior with a bomb package. Like, we're talking about like the pirate that brings back the weapons, Dr. Krasnov. Like, this deck was all about the bombs, and like, this deck was a little frustrating for some people, because if you're playing a deck that, you know, couldn't kill Bomb Warrior, then you were just gonna die because you have to naturally draw through your deck. And it just got a little bit frustrating to deal with it for that reason. But I believe that Bomb Warrior is like it's just a different control warrior. And control warrior for some people is just always going to be an archetype they don't enjoy. And I personally didn't mind going up against Bomb Warrior. Like, there are the times where, like, you know, I drew 4 bombs and I was angry and I hated this deck and stuff like that. But I'm not going to let that rule how I put it on the tier list, because I believe the B tier is honestly fine. Like, you compare it to, like, Shudderwock Shaman, you compare it to Naga Warlock, you compare it to Secret Mage, like, Bomb Warrior's fine compared to what the other Degenerate decks have been in the past. So I believe at a B tier, it's absolutely fine. What was not fine was how ridiculous Demon Hunter was before any of the nerfs happened. I tried to do so much digging with the deck list of this deck, because like I remember a lot of people playing the Imprisoned Antony like all the time, and like the deck, like it had an absolutely ridiculous win rate. So I don't even know if this deck that I'm showing is like the actual deck that people were playing when Demon Hunter was absolutely ridiculous. But put in cards in Demon Hunter and it would literally just win games, because Demon Hunter I think had like a 55% win rate, and then no other deck had above a 46% win rate, like no other class actually. So like Demon Hunter, for that reason, like it absolutely broke Hearthstone, and it goes in the SS tier because kind of similar to the Jade Druid situation, like you only had one class to even consider playing at the time, and it was Demon Hunter. That was it. If you played anything else, you had a subpar win rate. It was not good against literally half the meta, because half the meta was playing Demon Hunter, and it literally broke Hearthstone. There's no other way to describe it. Like, Demon Hunter legitimately broke Hearthstone. So because of that, it has to go in the SS tier, because it made people excited to play the game again, and then some of them quit because they're like, I'm not dealing with Demon Hunter for this long. This is a little ridiculous. And so a Demon Hunter that's a little bit less ridiculous is actually Soul Demon Hunter, and I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm putting it in the B tier. The reason why Soul Demon Hunter goes in the B tier is because this deck actually had a lot of interesting ways of being played. It wasn't exactly a face deck, it wasn't exactly a mid-range deck, it wasn't exactly a control deck. It was very, very specific to the game that you were in at the time and the cards that you were given. So every now and again, you wanted to just go slam the face, because if you didn't, then you didn't have enough, like, resources in order to actively threaten your opponent, and as a Soul Demon Hunter you had ways of being able to do that, but then there were other ways to where you needed to play for like a more board centric approach, to where like you need to be able to get rid of the priest's minions because you don't want Apotheosis to come down, that kind of stuff. But I believe that Soul Demon Hunter was a very, very fair deck, and after they finally got Demon Hunter to calm down a little bit in the power level department, then this was actually like what I believe was a very optimal Demon Hunter playing experience. I actually have a 1000 win portrait on Demon Hunter, so I've played a lot of different archetypes, and I would say that Soul Demon Hunter was probably, I think, a fourth of my wins, because of just, I loved playing this deck. It was really, really interesting, and I also brought it to some open cups and did pretty well with it. So Soul Demon Hunter, it was a lot more balanced and a lot more fair of a deck compared to a lot of the other decks that we're seeing on this list. So for that reason, I believe B tier is more than fair. But you want to know something that's not fair? Unnerfed Quest Rogue. Where to even begin with this one? So, for those of you that are wondering the differences between what current Quest Rogue is with the nerfs with the nerfs reverted versus what Quest Rogue was in the beginning, there's one thing you gotta realize. Quest Rogue in the beginning had almost no weaknesses because there was so many less cards available, and aggro literally was not good enough because there were ways of just being able to shut them out when you were able to complete the quest as early as turn 4. That's right, you can complete the quest as early as turn 4 sometimes when you were playing this deck, because Rogue has so many ways of bouncing the same card over and over and over again. So it's like, Quest Rogue now, I believe, is fine. And as you can see right now in the wild meta, it's not overtaking anything by any means necessary. You can still play Quest Rogue and still have that original feeling that you had with the deck during the Ungoro days, but it is not going to reflect what it was during the actual Ungoro meta, when there were so many less tools available for literally everything. So Quest Rogue goes in the S tier because I literally remember breaking my phone, being so mad at this deck. Like, I literally grabbed my phone, chucked it at a wall because I lost like a game either playing as Quest Rogue or against Quest Rogue. It was probably a mirror if you want my honest opinion. But this deck literally not only made people break their phones, but some people just completely did not want to play up against Rogue at all. They would immediately concede if they saw it, and some people went with the heavy Rogue hate whenever they went with like tournaments and stuff like that, so they just didn't want to deal with it. They just banned it immediately. So it goes in the S tier very, very justifiably because it broke Hearthstone and it broke my phone. So next up is Dr. Boom Control Warrior. This particular deck was kind of hard for me to pick just because there's a lot of interesting Control Warrior lists that have been relevant throughout the time. But there was somebody that specifically mentioned Dr. Boom in the Twitter post that I made, so that's the reason why we're highlighting Dr. Boom Control Warrior versus any other Control Warrior deck at the time. And if you want my honest opinion, this was probably the most frustrating time to go up against this deck because I played Wallet Warrior a lot in the beginning, and Control Warrior was an archetype that I enjoyed immensely throughout Hearthstone's history, but this particular meta was very, very frustrating because, like, Control Warrior was number 1, and the reason why it was number 1 was because mechs had Rush all the time, and when you had, like, Omega Assembly, and you had Zilliax and stuff like that, like, Control Warrior had ways of literally bringing itself back from the brink of death, and then some with, like, insane amounts of armor gain, pulling back the board, infinite generation, damage to literally everything, bombs, like, you had so Elysiana, like, there were so many ways in being able to play Control Warrior back in the day. So it was just like, with Dr. Boom, it just enabled it to obscene amounts of heights, but I'm only going to keep it at an A tier, only because it was a deck that you really had to play well. There were some people that were like, yeah, you just played Boom on 7 and you just won the game because mechs had Rush. But when you were a good seasoned player with Control Warrior, you were able to play some pretty cool games of Hearthstone. And, like, as frustrating as it was for some people to play Control Warrior versus, like, Cyclone Mage, I actually really enjoyed some of those matches at the beginning before, like, it was, like, every single game I would play. But, like at the beginning, it was really, really interesting to, like, okay, do I go for my Brawl now? Do I leave up this minion here, take a bit of damage so that way I can catch them with, like, their second Conjures after they played it? Like, it was a deck that really let a good player be good. And so I don't think it was, like, degenerate per se. Like, it was definitely ridiculously good, but I believe an A tier is pretty solid compared to the other decks that are already in S tier. This next deck is a deck that sparked a lot of controversy in the previous meta because I don't know if you guys realize this, but a deck that removes your opponent's tempo while building up your own is a pretty good deck as it turns out. And that deck that we're talking about is, of course, Weapon Rogue because, well, this deck just kind of, it left decks, like, out of the meta. Like, it just completely purged a lot of the classes and a lot of the archetypes that were available at the time. So for this reason, I am putting it in the S tier. And it's like, I originally wanted to put this in the A tier because Aggro Rogue had, like, Aggro Weapon Rogue had ways of being beaten. But it was one of those things to where, like, this deck was just so frustrating to go up against when you knew what you were fighting, to the point where it was just like you didn't want to go up. You didn't want to play it. You just didn't want to play the game of Hearthstone when you knew that when they had the weapon on turn 3. And it's just like, please, like, I don't want to be here anymore. Give me my ooze and please release me from this game. Like, I played a lot of OTK Demon Hunter at the time, so, like, I feel like that's why it kind of changes my perception on this deck just a little bit. Because I actually enjoyed this matchup whenever I was playing as the Demon Hunter, and I actually had ways of killing them. Like, if you had your ooze and you had ways of, like, healing and stuff like that, I think it was a pretty interesting matchup because killing one weapon didn't automatically win you the game. Like, it definitely really helped, but with the healing cards that you had lots of ways of being able to stop the damage that they had on the second weapon, and I still ended up losing some games even when I played Ooze and stuff like that. But Weapon Rogue was just a deck that was just too powerful. I think that cards like Self-Sharpening Sword, in my opinion, are very, very toxic for the game because I don't like it where everything is just, it's all about this one card, and the rest of your deck supports this one card, and if you don't get this one card, well then sorry, bucko, you didn't win the game. You're playing a subpar deck at that point. And just, if you take out the Self-Sharpening Sword, this deck literally doesn't even become competitively viable anymore, or at least not built this way. You probably need, like, Jandis or something else to give it some more meat or something. But Weapon Rogue goes in the S tier because Penflinger saying, hey, loser, over and over again, and getting hit with, like, more than 10 damage by, like, turn 4 by one weapon, it's a little ridiculous. This next deck is an opinion that I'm going to have to stand my ground on, because not only did I play this deck back when it was first conceived, but it's also a deck that has just gotten a lot of power throughout the times of Hearthstone. But that deck is Odd Paladin. And I am putting it at a B tier, and that's already, like, I can hear the keyboards going, man. I can hear that typing, and, well, let me go ahead and explain myself before you guys, you know, throw me over the cliff. Odd Paladin is a deck that's 100% dependent on the matchup that you're going up against, right? So it's like one of those decks to where I don't really believe it can be that toxic because, I mean, it does shout out matchups. It's completely unfun to go up against a deck that does nothing but just play the hero power over and over and over again. But it's just a deck that just automatically loses to like Warlock in a lot of situations. Like when you play Defile, suddenly your 1/1s are just gone and you don't have to deal with it and stuff like that. And you have ways of like beating it in the face very, very quickly. So for that reason, like I believe that, you know, Odd Paladin is a very, very consistent mid-range deck, and I would like to see it go in a direction to where it tries to outvalue people more with the hero power, more than just like swarm the board, hit the face as soon as possible, because those decks just, when they are off the board, they get destroyed very, very easily, and then suddenly when you play bigger minions, 1/1s really don't make a difference anymore. And I believe that Odd Paladin is just not really seeing a lot of play right now, because what's popular in Wild right now is how quickly you're killing your opponent, not how quickly you're building up a board full of 1/1s. If anything, building up a board of 8/8s is a lot more important right now with like Celestial Alignment Druid, and even that deck is not even like absolutely top tier. So Odd Paladin, I believe in the B tier, is absolutely fine because it had lots of ways of losing. I ended up losing a very, very important match back when I played this deck in the DreamHack days, where Odd Paladin was supposed to absolutely crush I think like Shaman or something like that. And unfortunately, there were just times to where like the healing was too much, the taunts were too much, and Odd Paladin just couldn't get over the hump. So for that reason, I believe B tier is more than fair. Next up is a deck that has been threatening Hearthstone's Wild community for so long, and it's finally seeing a little bit of a deviation from play, but it is the Menace Kingsbane Rogue. Right now, Kingsbane Rogue is not seeing a lot of play in Wild, but like literally the meta before it, Kingsbane was like almost the best deck on top of like Darkglare Warlock. And throughout Hearthstone's history, Kingsbane has just been, it's been a good card. There's been a lot of ways of being able to utilize the cards, so like that's why I'm not really like that mad at it, because I think it's a very, very interesting I think it's a very interesting card from a design perspective. But in power level, this card is definitely annoying to go up against, because seeing the same weapon come over like just come down on the field over and over and over again is ridiculous. And then back in its prime, Kingsbane used to have lifesteal. So if you literally just made it to made it your goal to make the thickest weapon you possibly could with like Shadow Valera with all your poisons, then suddenly like this weapon would just always bring you back from like the edge of death. And it was ridiculous. Like your opponent needed 30 damage on the field in order to kill you, or they needed a way to get rid of your weapon and then not prevent you from being able to get it again. And there was no deck that was able to prevent them from being able to get it, unless somehow you were able to fill up your opponent's hand with 10 cards, then kill the Kingsbane, and then know that Kingsbane's immediately coming off the next draw in order to mill it. So, not putting it in an S tier, I'll tell you that. It's going in an A tier. It's not going in an S tier because I believe that Kingsbane is, I don't want to say fair. It's not a fair deck, but it's not nearly as degenerate as what it has been in the past. And like, if it still had the lifesteal to this day, it would definitely be an S tier. But now you could out aggro it. You can sometimes, prevent like, face damage with like a taunt or something like that. And Kingsbane Rogue just isn't like, it's not on top of the Wild meta right now. And if it was, I believe, it would give it some warrant for an S tier. But I believe that Kingsbane Rogue is solid at an A tier, almost like A plus tier. I almost want to put it in the S. Like I almost did, decided not to when I looked at everything else that was S. And I'm just going to go ahead and put it in an A tier because this deck has had a lot of applications, and Kingsbane itself is a very interesting card. Unlike, I would say, like Self-Sharpening Sword, when you only have like one real direction of being able to play it. So Kingsbane Rogue being an A tier, probably a little bit controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and stick to my guns on this one. Next up is Tickatus. That's pretty much it. Tickatus. It's just Tickatus and Warlock that we're talking about, and the deck that we're going to highlight is his current application in Arena Lock. Like, Tickatus is a card that I am okay with. Go ahead and throw your tomatoes at me. I'm absolutely fine. I'll go ahead and die on this cross because Tickatus is a card that I've been a lot more, like, I'm frustrated whenever I go up against it, and that's the whole point of this card. You're supposed to be frustrated whenever your opponent plays it. But it's not a card that, like, absolutely wins the game when it comes down. There are still ways of being able to win after it gets played. It's not meta-defining in either format. It's just a card that sucks to go up against. Mindrender, Lucia, and Tickatus are always going to be hot button issues in Hearthstone because people don't like their cards being taken away from them, and that's a very, very legitimate worry. But I'm putting it in the C tier only because it is not meta-defining, and there are ways to beat it. Like, I'm not happy putting it in the C tier, trust me. Do you think I want to be this guy that is like, you know, Tickatus is fine, and then suddenly everybody just throws their lawn chairs at him and stuff like that? No, like, I don't want to be that guy. But I gotta stick to my opinion on this one, because I don't believe that Tickatus is an absolutely meta-defining card, and it is degenerate. Don't get me wrong, that's why it's on this video. It's a degenerate deck. But compared to, like, this next deck that I'm about to point out, I believe that Tickatus just, it has ways of being beaten, and it doesn't win the game as soon as it comes down. Like, it may destroy your combo card, but, you know, Reno Lock needs a way to be able to interact with combos. So, because of that, I believe that C tier is, I mean, it sucks to see it there, but I'm fine with Tickatus as a card, and if you, like, maybe bump him up to, like, 7 mana, I'm gonna be, like, I'm not really gonna care either way. Like, it's gonna prevent the card from being played, that's 100%, but I really like the idea of, like, Yashiraj and Tickatus being a thing, so... C tier, you're staying there, Tickatus, I'm sorry. So if Clark doesn't believe that Tickatus is a problem, then what would be considered a problem? How about Starliner Druid? Yeah, that was a deck that was fun to go up against when you just died on, like, turn 5 because of lethal damage. Like, good lord, Starliner Druid was a deck that was all about just drawing your combo cards, because Psych Melon literally drew everything that you needed, and then you would just play Aviana Kun, play Brand, play all these other cards, and then you play your Starliner, and then bam, you just dealt 28 damage like that. Like, it was that easy. Like, and then you just needed a little bit more damage to get there, and this deck was absolutely destroying the wild meta for so long. And I actually remember where I was when I was playing up against this deck for the very first time. I was on my way back from a gig, actually, I believe in Alabama, and just, like, I went up against this deck, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna play standard now. I don't want to play wild after seeing this deck. And, like, Dane hated it, Zeddy hated it, pretty much anybody that played wild hated it. I know Raffle hated it, that's for sure. So this deck definitely goes in the S tier, because compared to the Tickatus, man, which one would you rather see more often? Would you rather see 5 of your cards destroyed by, like, turn 7, turn 8? Or would you rather see yourself dead by turn 5, turn 6? The choice is yours.